They don't reject anyone anymore since the incident. They just want to avoid AI going Hitlerite. I guess that makes sense. You know, the University of Arts in Vienna did actually recommend that Hitler become an architect because he liked architectural paintings. Not so much that he was a wretched painter, it's just he was derivative. Like there were issues with his paintings. They weren't very creative. I mean, it was a very high-level art university. Perspective was bad. Well, it was better than mine when I paint, which I don't, you know. It just wasn't his, you know, standards were high. That's it. Also, Hitler's style of precisionism was considered old hat at the time. I mean, look at like paintings from like the 1910s or 1920s in Europe. Just in general, look at the pull from romanticism and more towards, I guess, what then would have been considered pretty avant-garde. Like, I can understand why after all of that, you know, it wouldn't be like, yeah, let's admit this student, he's pretty good at doing like, you know, architectural paintings, right? You know, it's just not, but he sucked at the paintings, right? I think it's important to understand that the reason that Hitler was rejected wasn't because of his lack of technical precision or competence. It's because of that mixed with the fact that his art was old hat, you know? The more you're doing something that everyone expects you to do, the better you have to do it. The more you're doing something new and innovative, the more leeway you have in execution. People get into these weird, like people with clearly no art history knowledge, mind you, get into these arguments over like whether or not Hitler's paintings were terrible. And the point isn't like, for one, they're not terrible. The point is just that, and I think it's more interesting too. Like, doesn't it make more sense, considering Hitler is the fascist, doesn't it make more sense to understand that his rejection was more a consequence of his inability to adopt or at least express newer forms of thinking, newer modalities into his art? It was because his art was, in a word, conservative. If it was more progressive, if it was more daring or innovative, people would have been more interested in it. Which you see playing all over again when the Nazis have their degenerate art gallery, right? Where they have a gallery of like good Aryan art, acceptable stuff, right? Like good, upstanding, fascist approved. And then you have the degenerate art, and the degenerate art gallery was way more popular. Of course, that's because all the Nazis would go there and they'd be like, ugh, disgusting. They were basically doing the like 1930s equivalent of, oh my God, you're saying she's posting what on Maine? What's her at? So I can know not to follow her. Like they were doing that, but with degenerate art, essentially. You know, art by communists and Jews and more like evocative styles. It's just more interesting, you know? Not to say that all architectural paintings are the same. They're not, right? There's a ton of variety, and I find them beautiful when they're done well, right? But, you know, people do like being exposed to new ideas. Even fascists, they just, you know, pretend that they're not engaging with that, right? Like they pretend they don't. What's your source and don't say degree? Source for what? What claim? There are some minor perspective issues, but for the most part, I just think it's the oversaturation of the form. It is funny that Wikipedia has a whole page for critiques of his art. Is there a logical fallacy for requesting a source instead of countering the argument? Yeah, it's called being a chatter. Anyway, sometimes I just think that it comes across a little bit as cope when people say that Hitler was a bad painter, and they're actually misunderstanding the problems with his art. I think you can actually make a much better argument against his admission into Vienna. For one, the idea that anyone would argue like, oh, over 100 years ago, this guy should have gotten into college. Like, okay, there are people today who should or shouldn't be in college, you know? It's just more about like, what was Hitler interested in? He was interested in architecture. See? It's pretty clear when you look at what he chooses to paint. And like, I like the buildings that he likes for the most part. You know, like, I mean, certainly if I was, you know, as an American, there are no buildings that look like this in America, right? I mean, not really. So I'd love to walk around a building that looked like this. But then you take a look at, you know, other paintings being made at this time. It makes sense that the Nazi was uncreative. Well, I don't know. I mean, this was quite a bit before he became chancellor. I don't know how much of it was informed by an explicit political ideology. I think it's more likely, because we see this happen time and time again, it seems more likely to me that Hitler probably would have followed more or less the same trajectory that literally every fascist seems to, which is you have trouble acclimating to your social environment. You feel kind of like cucked by the world, you know. You have trouble getting along with women. You feel emasculated. You have a respect for big ideas, like ethnicity, race, government, power, but you don't have much patience for the nitty gritty of how those things are enacted. And you don't really care about the consequences of those policies. You just like them as narratives, right? And I think you can see some of that in his paintings. I don't think I would ever look at a painting like this and say, oh, the person who painted this was a fascist. But if you showed me a bunch of paintings that look very much like this one and said, yeah, the person who painted these would later go on to be a fascist, not Hitler necessarily, any fascist. It could be like a nameless person in history. I would go, I could understand that. I could see how a person with some artistic talent would be interested in the symbology of like grandiose architecture, right? They're interested in the form and character of power and culture and legacy, and in this case, obviously, like neo classical and Germanic architecture, you know. But maybe they're not as interested in the little guy. Maybe they're not as interested in people, which you kind of see, right? But look, you have a sort of a mix of kitschy German pastoralism, right? Fantasizing about the Alps, the you know, the wilderness, um, the farm life, the traditionalist stuff, you know, and also industry, power. You have legacy power, like, you know, old castles, which there are plenty of in Germany. You know, you've got stuff like that. Um, and here you go. And then you've got like newer forms of power, right? You have like more modern looking yeah, you all get the point that I'm getting at, right? You just have the blend. You have a mix of like reverence for the power implied by institutions, mixed with like a sort of kitschy pastoral fondness, mixed with, you know, you've got a keen fondness for things like architecture and the symbology of power, but not so much for people, right? You don't see much in the way of people. The only real people painting listed here is this one, which I think is a fine and cute painting, though this one, perspective wise, is a actually like a real problem. Like this one's bad enough that it actually is a bit distracting in my opinion. I do like his mustache though. Cool clothes though. Yeah, I don't know what garment this is. You don't have to say his art is bad. You can say he is evil, so the merit of his art doesn't matter. Well, I'm not making either point, though obviously he is evil. I'm just making the point that I think it's interesting that you can often you can derive a lot of a person's political ideology from even stuff like this. You know what I mean? I do think it's rather telling, for example, that in all these architectural paintings, you know, you have basically like no visible people. You have some like little figures, right? Like down here, this lady's putting up clothes in the hanger. And the one time you see you see people front and center in the painting, it's kitschy. I don't necessarily mean that in a negative way, but you know what I mean, right? What's the one person painting you're going to do? The one that focuses on humans? Well, it's going to be like a very traditional, it's a hunter, it's a huntsman going out. I mean, that's like literally pre-industrial revolution profession. And he's got like his bow and they're in love, you know, it's like a couple and it's love. And well, there's nothing wrong with the subject, but it is interesting. There's not much I don't want to use the word controversy because that's not what I'm getting at here. It's more like there's not much of interest narratively. Does that make sense? Like, what are you saying? Right? It's slop. No, it's not slop. It just doesn't provoke much thought, I guess. You know? Not gonna lie, this feels like confirmation bias. I disagree. I disagree. I think that there's no way for me to disprove that. I'm just saying I think that you can I think that if you look at this, you can kind of like derive that reasoning, you know? Rockwell-esque slice of life. Um, a little, though Rockwell, well, in addition to him being like a phenomenal, like generationally talented painter, um, Rockwell's little excerpts of life were, I think, a lot more interesting. This is the famous Facts of Life by Norman Rockwell, right? Is this not a lot more interesting? So obviously Rockwell, to compare Rockwell and Hitler as painters is like to insult Rockwell. Rockwell is obscenely good. But like this, I feel like this is like there you can have a discussion on this. Hold on, let me close the door. Keep squeaking. This is 100 times better. Well, obviously in terms of technical execution, of course, Rockwell is, I mean, he's Rockwell, right? But it goes beyond that. It's, you know, a broader Dude, he's so good. He's so good. Even when he's doing stuff that's kitschy. And he often does, right? Because he was often like commissioned to do kitschy stuff. But he's very, very, very talented. I think I remember reading this blurb. So obviously Rockwell basically like defined Americana. Like when we think of the 1950s, like in art, we think of, you know, we think of Norman Rockwell. He's so good. He I think I remember this from my art history class. Um I think so Norman Rockwell was okay, he was an older guy in the 50s, right? He definitely wasn't like a progressive on race by our standards, but I think that there was a point in his career where he was getting commissioned to do work that was being used by more overt white supremacists, and I believe he stopped taking that work. There was another like very Americana um oriented painter, like another one like working around that time who did continue to take that work, and I think Rockwell like steered away from it. Of course, there were a lot of racists back in the day who really wanted to use Rockwell's work. Ooh, look at those raw denim overalls, looking good. He painted this on racial integration, the problem that we all live with. A lot to say, huh? See, it's not just the quality of the painting, right? Why the dude's dancing? They're doing a funky little jig. She's stepping with the opposite feet of the men. Wow, you're right. All of the men have their left foot forward. She has her hands in the same position as them, but her feet, her right foot is the one that's forward. Man knows his craft. He knows. He knows his craft. You can barely see the hard R in the background. It was very tasteful of him to only put it in like faded like that, you know?